is going to start. Yeah.
Okay, colleagues, it's just after 4 o'clock. I'm going to call the meeting to order. This is the first opportunity for us to get together since the tragedy occurred on Friday when the Broncos Humboldt team bus had a serious accident. Many people lost their lives, players, coaches, broadcaster, statistician, and I know that right across Canada, people's hearts are going out to the families, to the friends, to those connected to this team. And I wanted to ask for a moment of silence in memory of those that we lost on Friday. Thank you. Colleagues, I'll remind you that we have lit a number of buildings, City Hall and some other buildings here in London, green and gold, in memory of those that have been lost. The buildings will remain green and gold every evening to the end of the week until Friday. Okay. I'll look for any disclosures of pecuniary interest at this time. There are none. Anything on the consent? There is not. Scheduled items, working our way through to items for direction. What I'd like to do with the schedule today, colleagues, is move 5.1. This is the London and Middlesex Housing Corporation item of business up. And I'm suggesting that we deal with that right now. And then we'll move to the London Hydro shareholder meeting right after that. And if there are no objections, then that's what I'll do. So we'll welcome the delegation then from the London and Middlesex Housing Corporation. If you could please come up to the podium. And I wonder if the committee chair wants to make any opening remarks. I know that this was a request for additional information. Or if Councillor Hopkins, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. And just to remind my colleagues, this was referred back at the last SPPC meeting. And at that time, we had two boards appointing members to their board. This one was referred back. And I spoke at that time about a bylaw being in place. And I wanted just to clarify that a little bit, that there is a notice under the housing. There's a local standards conflict notice that the board approved under the Housing Act when it comes to conflict of interest, when it comes to regeneration of our buildings, renovations, things like that. So I just wanted to make that clarification, and I know there's a number of board members here from London Middlesex Housing Corporation that will speak in length to the process and our strategic plan. So thank you.
Thank you. And with that, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you to Councillor Hopkins, who is not only your colleague but ours on the board, and thank you for those remarks to get us started. My name is Michael Bazzelli. I'm the chair of the board of directors of LMHC, and I'm joined by my colleagues Marcy, Alan Easton, and Sarah Campbell with me here. And we want to make our comments brief because we feel that this doesn't have to be any longer than it needs to be. We also have some colleagues joining us in the upper floor as well. And this does, ladies and gentlemen, pick up on your last meeting in this forum. And 2 points in particular that we'd like to make. And the first has to do with what I think of as a purely technical matter that I think might have been just a bit of misunderstanding in this forum last time, and that is around the appointments process. I was taking it on everyone's word that there was some deliberation about that, and ultimately, as Councillor Hopkins mentioned, that the item was referred back. And in a way, I'm glad it has been. That gives us a chance to appear before you and just clarify. And the point around the technical point around the appointments process is that you don't need me to appear here to tell you that it's your choice to appoint members to our board. We see it as a moment when we should provide input to you on that process, and that's what we've done, and that's done under the auspices of the Housing Division notice that you have before you in the package that we've provided. And the second item is relating to some of the firestorm that you may or may not be aware of, but that grew out of the meeting that you had. And having reviewed the video transcript of that meeting, which thankfully appeared before I could appear here today, so I think just Thursday or Friday that video was posted, and it gave me a chance to review that. And my first time through reviewing that video, I thought, well, how could there be such a firestorm around any questions at all around our commitment as an organization and a board to the philosophies of diversity and inclusion? And of course, we don't feel there could be, but nevertheless, there seemed to be some public discourse and noise about that. So I watched the video with interest and wasn't sure how that could have possibly happened, so watched it again. And I'm not sure if I could pin it particularly to anything that was actually said in the room. And I think it's just noise out there. As self-preservation, I don't pay too much attention. I don't participate in social media at all, never have. Maybe never will. But luckily, others endure the pain of having to read some of the things that are written. And there was also a mainstream media interview that I think also, Marcy Allen Easton reminded me of that didn't particularly do us any favors as well. But our commitment to diversity and inclusion has been evidenced in virtually everything we've been doing as a board and as a corporation for several years, including in the ways that we've presented some of our reportage back to you. So bottom line is, notwithstanding the referral and the questioning around the appointment process, we'd accept anyone you appoint. This is my 4th year on the board. We're 9. And being 9, as you might imagine, there is turnover. And when there's turnover, we always bring new people on. We onboard them. We embrace them. We do training. And we do all of those good things to make sure that we function as best we can. Our input from your last meeting that was referred was my letter sent on behalf of the board. The letter was dated the 23rd of March. And in that letter, I identified 4 names of individuals we'd like to appoint. As I mentioned, we're a board of 9. We had a resignation of 1 female member, and that meant that our balance of 4 women and 5 men might go a little too far one way. And so we'd like to keep it at 4 and 5 or 5 and 4. Just because that seems to make a lot of sense to us in terms of board gender balance. And so as a result, we nominated from the list of applicants that was on your agenda, Anne-Marie Evans, Deborah Peckham, and Elizabeth Pelosa. And as I say, there was a technical issue around the appointment process and the conflict of interest piece. I'm happy to answer any questions about that. But we also identified Roa Mohammed as a potential board candidate as well from the list of, I forget now, 9 or 10 candidates that you had. So I just wanted to clarify those 2 points, which I think were first and foremost in our minds. But I'll also turn it over to Sarah Campbell, who is our new chair of our Tenant Services Committee, which is a new committee that we've established just beginning in March to speak to the ongoing relationship we have with the shareholders. So, Sarah.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. It's my pleasure to really speak to you today about LMHC's current positioning around amplifying the voice of our tenants and being a board that's interested and engaged with listening to the voice of the tenants. As many of you know, LMHC has gone through a robust strategic planning process. We've re-articulated our values through We Care. And part of that has been even restructuring at the board level where we have committees set up, one of which is the Tenant Services Committee, which I'm pleased to be chairing. I just wanted to take the opportunity, sometimes when negative things happen, you have an opportunity to restate the positive things that are happening within our organization, and I thought this is what an opportunity to share with you and with the public a little bit about what's happening at LMHC. So first and foremost, our board of directors is made up by a committed group of volunteers, and we have been working closely with the leadership team and the staff in the development of that clearly articulated vision and strategic plan, which calls out very specifically the subject of diversity and inclusion. And similar to many other organizations in our city, as the Me Too movement has come out and many other issues that have highlighted gender inequity, our organization has also looked at that. In fact, at our board table, we have issued a letter to all staff around diversity, inclusion, highlighting some training around how to be an ally and how to stand up for one another and really embed that into the culture of the organization. As anyone part of a large organization like the city or LMHC knows, that's a long-term commitment. But we have done our first steps long before this discussion came to your attention, and so I wanted to highlight that. Additionally, as Michael has so rightly pointed out, it's ultimately your decision to appoint people to our board, and we are here really in service to our community, and even in making recommendations in terms of who you might consider off the list. That's really a formality where we look at the needs of the board, the needs of the organization, and do our best to support you as councillors in making an informed decision about those appointments. There's no malice or intention to ever steer in the wrong direction. And I just think it's very helpful, which brings me to my final point, that you as our primary and only shareholder, in fact, help to amplify our organization's shift in culture and the changes that we're trying to portray in our community. We need you to, at every opportunity, help us to highlight that we want to see diversity and inclusion. We need you to speak about the board members, the organization, and our values, We Care, that we've articulated. We need you to also articulate those as our shareholder. We look to you to help us in maintaining that gender balance on our board and to ensure the diversity that we are seeking to make sure is apparent to those who might examine our organization. And finally, we look to you to hold us accountable, to make sure that we are actually living out those values. And so thank you for this opportunity to share the ways that we're trying to amplify the voice of our tenants. I can tell you that we are looking at our tenant engagement strategy. We're looking at our community engagement strategy, and all of those things are active parts of our this year's work plan, not next year's, not pushing it off into the future. That's right now. And so we look for your continued support in making that possible and helping us to do that in the best way that serves the tenants, our community, and helps us to uphold our governance role. We also want to just point out that if it is your choice to appoint a tenant to the board, that there's maybe some other mitigation strategies we could look at. So in terms of solving problems, if there is going to be conflict of interest, potentially we could add another board member. One of the challenges of being a board of 9 is that we have at times struggled with quorum. This is a very active board. I can speak to, I saw the hours you put in at SPPC last week and thought, oh, this is a lot like LMHC board meetings, you know, many, many hours in these board meetings. And sometimes we do struggle with quorum. And so if it's your choice to appoint someone where there might be a high likelihood of conflict of interest, if you would also consider an additional board member potentially so that we can maintain that governance structure that's needed to be moving forward at all times. We would appreciate that. I would like to pass this over to Marcy to speak about one of our other important elements to this, which is the need to have people with lived experience on our board, which is something that this current board actually put onto our matrix of how we make recommendations to you in terms of what's needed in our organization. And Marcy is going to speak about her own experience and how that lived experience reflects in her work as a board member.
Thank you, Sarah. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Again, my name is Marcy Allen Easton. I'm the vice chair.
Just before you start, I'm just going to ask Matt if he could come forward and lower the podium a little bit.
I get
We have the
that.
technology.
Happens a lot. Thanks, Matt. Is that better?
It's good to see you.
I am flat. Again, my name is Marcy Allen Easton. I'm the vice chair of London Middlesex Housing Corporation, and I just wanted to spend a few minutes talking today. I too just watched the video from the SPPC meeting last week, and I know as I watched it, I listened to folks talk about the importance of lived experience and tenants. And I know Michael has talked a little bit about tenants and the conflict that goes, the perceived conflict or conflict that goes with that. As a person, I'm sure everyone is aware of my story, but I am a person with lived experience. I grew up in London Middlesex Housing as a child. I've had family, including stepchildren and brothers, sisters, aunts, uncles, all living in Middlesex Housing, and some living outside of London and other types of social housing developments. Do I think there's a need for more people on the board with lived experience? Yes, I do. I'm one voice, and I think there's more. But we have other needs as well. And we outlined them. We looked at the list of names that were presented to us, and we went through the list, and we outlined some of the areas we were lacking. So, for instance, legal or social work, areas that we don't have on the board. We need those too. And once they're filled, then we can start again and add more lived experience. But we definitely need the other areas. It's tough to not have somebody with, not have all of those areas filled. We could fill the whole board with lived experience, but then we'd be lacking in some of those areas. And the one thing I do want to point out today is that I can tell you this board does concern themselves with the tenant requirements and needs, and they do take lived experience into consideration. Anytime something up, they ask me. They bring my voice, even if it's another committee that I'm not part of. If something comes up where they do want this voice, they do come to me and they do ask me. Councillor Hopkins, on a regular basis during the meetings, will look to me and ask me. And if I don't know the answer, I do know someone that does. So I go and I ask the questions myself. So again, I want to make council and the mayor aware that it is a concern, that it is an area that we definitely could use more voices. Maybe you want to consider adding some more members so that we could have those voices. That would be great. And the only other thing I wanted to point out, I think Michael touched it as well. We looked at the names and we looked to gender balance. It's one of the areas that I think is important on the board as well. And we had some folks on the list that filled the boxes that we needed checked that were female. The departing member was a female. And that's what we filled with. But that certainly doesn't mean that we wouldn't, if the gender balance was tipped the other way, that we wouldn't look for a male on the list. We would, absolutely. But in this case, we were looking at a female. I know there were names brought up from the male side of things during the SPPC meeting. So I just wanted to clarify that it wasn't that we were ignoring certain names. It just wasn't one of the boxes at the time we needed ticked. So I hope that clears up some things for everybody. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. Questions from the committee? I know I have Councillor Salee and Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you all for coming. I just have a couple questions to start off with through the chair. And I don't want my questions to be perceived as my opinion, but I just wanted to kind of have a better understanding as I'm not too aware and not part of this. So my first question was, I know you guys have, I guess, is it a bylaw or is it just kind of an unwritten policy where you guys recommend a name? Or is that just kind of just something people have done over the years, is my first question.
So sorry, is this question in relation to the conflict of interest piece or just the process of providing input on the appointment of a board member?
So providing names for interest, not conflict of interest, but sorry, when you're saying these are the 3 people we're recommending or the 1 person we're recommending to sit on the board.
Yeah, we see that as our responsibility to see if we can fulfill different kinds of criteria, including expertise and lived experience in providing input into the process. Understanding, of course, as I've said, that the decision-making process, including things like the decision whether to interview prospective board members or not, is entirely up to you. So it's a matter of providing input.
Thank you. So, so there's no bylaw or policy that states that, just to be clear, I just want to be very clear.
There's nothing that requires us to provide input.
And then my second question I had was regarding the bylaw, or sorry, if there's a bylaw regarding conflicts of interest, was there, I think you guys were saying that there's a concern with conflict of interest if a resident lives there. Was there anything in policy or anything like that? I just wanted to be clear on that.
The answer is maybe. Fortunately, we have this package here before us that includes our submission for this meeting. And it's in the spirit of what's in the Housing Division notice. That's page 7 of 33 of the package. And it's in the spirit of some of the items in that, that notice in particular that leads us to respond to the kinds of conflicts of interest that may arise or may be perceived to arise when you have a resident who's also a board member. And so we take it as our responsibility to advise you of that.
Thank you.
Sorry, I knew I read something about this. Okay, so our shareholder agreement is actually where this is listed. So regarding board competencies, on July 25th, 2016, SPPC received a report from the city manager. There's an attachment listed, confirming through special resolution council's decision to make the following changes to the declaration of the sole shareholder as approved on November 25th, 2014. To amend the board composition as follows: city council representative, 1 city council recommendation representative, 2 provide for staggered board teams, which may require a one-time extension. And the one that I think is reflected here is provide for the LMHC to advise the municipal council of desired competencies when we're seeking applicants for vacancies on the board, section 6.2B, and to have the ability to put forward the names of applicants they would like to have considered for those vacancies. That is all.
And sorry, my last question to the chair. When you talk about the need for having someone with competencies or skill sets, so for example, there was an example mentioned through the chair about a lawyer. Do you guys not just want to just maybe in those instances hire someone, or could you better explain as to why you feel as if maybe those skill sets are more so needed than perhaps having, you know, a majority of a board who maybe has lived experience versus, you know, maybe having one lawyer at that time?
Okay, if I understand the question, the answer is that what we aim to do is take the board members you appoint, look at the competencies we have, and then try to fill the gaps when gaps appear. So for instance, Marcy's mentioned social work. And if that actually is not a gap that we currently have, so Sarah's background in social work, but if we saw that that was a gap that we needed to fill in future, then that would be a request that we would make in terms of the appointment process. So it's not that we are prescribing to have a particular set of competencies all the time, because it also depends on what the moving target is of the members that you appoint. And so that's always in flux, because you'll be appointing someone shortly and then possibly another 1 or 2 members later on this year as people's terms expire.
Thank you. So, Mr. Chair, I have a question. So is this just question time, or can I give my comments at this point as well?
Well, you know, you're at committee. You're welcome to give some comments, but I can come back to you as well.
Okay, so I'll just wrap up with my comments then. So I just wanted to say again, thank you for coming in. As far as related to my questions, I do think that the board has to have more of a focus and emphasis on lived experiences. I think I have no issues with the perceived conflict of interest. I think when I think of condos, most of the people who are on condo boards at a private commercial, a condominium, reside in that building, and I kind of see it kind of somewhat, some synergies and some similarities with that as well. And I think as far as I have a concern with a board recommending to, you know, council saying this is the people who we suggest for you to perhaps appoint. I think I have a concern with that. It would be as if my police service board would come and say, hey, this is who you should appoint to be on the police service board. And I think that sometimes that needs to kind of be some separation. So I think for me, that's just kind of my feedback that I wanted to give you on those fronts. So those are the things I don't support. And I think that, I appreciate what you guys are doing, and I appreciate that there's some gaps that you can identify, but I just wanted to make those comments.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Slee. We'll move to the next speaker in just one moment, but go ahead.
Okay, so there's a couple of responses I have to that. The first is, ladies and gentlemen, that I think it bears saying that when this matter was referred from your prior SPPC meeting, it does appear to me that when I was reviewing the video transcript, you did reflect on a recommendation for the appointment of a board member for another organization that seems to have been approved. And so it seems like you are open to taking recommendations, and we're perfectly happy to do that and continue doing that, and that's not a problem from our point of view. So I'm happy to disagree with you on that. The other point is on the issue of lived experience, that is actually an issue that we like to think that we've championed. We don't do that kind of thing with a lot of fanfare, but we do that. So it's been a couple of years actually that we've been coming to this forum to say that although our shareholder agreement doesn't actually specify anything to do with lived experience, that's actually been our priority. And if that's a fact that's forgotten, that's perfectly okay in my book, because it seems like you've internalized that, and as long as you've internalized that priority, that's fine with us. So if you're asking us back that we should be thinking about lived experience, actually we know we've done our job, because the shareholder agreement doesn't actually say anything about that. So that's something that we've brought to your attention a couple of years ago, last year again when we appointed new members, and again this year in the submissions that we made at our prior meeting. So thank you for the comments.
So we're getting close to cross debate here, and I'm going to ask our guests and also council colleagues to speak through the chair. Councillor Slee, you wanted one final word, and then we're going to move on to Councillor Van Holst.
Sure, and it wasn't me that went into cross debate. I just closed off on my comments and that happened. But what I was trying to say was, I just wanted to clarify that I wasn't speaking for council or policies. I was just saying my position on those matters.
Thank you. Councillor Van Holst, Squire, Morgan, Zafman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and through you to our guests. I understand you have an advisory board of tenants. Is that true? Maybe you would just speak to that for a moment.
Yes. We have a number of ways that tenants engage. So we do have an advisory board that meets with staff at LMHC. Additionally, at each of the locations, there's different levels of engagement as driven by the tenants themselves. So we have a few mechanisms for that kind of feedback. And as I mentioned, we're just in the forming stage of relooking at our tenant engagement strategy, which will involve a much more robust mechanism back to the board around tenant engagement strategy.
Okay, thank you. Well, that seems like to be a wise thing to do. Of course, we have an advisory board for diversity and inclusion here, because we never know who's going to end up at a table after a municipal election. Thank you for clarifying that our bylaws suggest, our shareholder agreement suggests that you should and are fine bringing forth names. So I'm happy with that. Then I think that's my comments. Thank you.
Councillor Squire.
I just want to make it clear that I think it's difficult when we're bringing our volunteers before us to sort of justify their actions when they're just trying to do as good a job as they can. After listening to you and the work you do, I have complete confidence that you're doing the best you can to make sure you're balancing those issues that you have to balance when you're appointing board members. I think if we start doing this to all of our various volunteer committees and groups, it's going to be difficult to get people who will come forward and stand here and have their actions challenged. So I certainly just wanted to make it clear that I appreciate the work you do, and I don't think you've done anything wrong. On another note, I think giving me recommendations, I'm happy to have them, as long as you understand I may not follow them. And as long as you're all right with that, I don't have any problem with it. I've never found it unusual to have committees providing names, letting us know what the expertise is they need. So I'm quite comfortable with what you're doing. I'm not comfortable with this sort of questioning of a volunteer board, and it goes to your intentions and what you're doing. And I think we should spend a lot less time on that and a lot more time on getting work done.
Councillor Morgan.
Thank you. I have a couple of points and then a question. The first on quorum. Unless there's something in your particular bylaws that precludes quorum, the way it works at municipal council is we have a quorum. If there's a conflict of interest, it actually can reduce the quorum requirements by one while that person is declaring on that particular issue, and we have the ability to still function. So if that's not clear in your bylaws, perhaps that's something that we can fix through the next shareholders meeting and can be looked into, because certainly I would see that as a restriction, but something that can be easily corrected, and we can mimic the way that we do it at municipal council, assuming that that's okay. So that would be the first point. On conflict of interest, I see that as manageable. I mean, I declare a conflict from time to time, sometimes on large issues. It's a function of having people who are involved in the community, and so I think, you know, managing it properly and declaring at the appropriate times is the best way. And on the quorum, I think that's a problem that we can try to solve. On the recommendations, I think, and I appreciate that you're doing exactly what we asked you to do, given previous directions of council. You're coming forward, giving us some suggestions on the competencies you need, the gaps you feel in your board, the names of the people who you feel meet those gaps. That's exactly what we've asked you to do in the past, and no one should be faulted for doing that. I think where part of the confusion lies was in the structuring of the previous letter. It wasn't on the agenda, but it was a subsequent communication to us. The way it was outlined, it was easily interpreted to say, these are the three people we want interviewed, and then it was separated in such a way that it appeared in juxtaposition that there was potentially a recommendation not to interview that candidate for conflict of interest reasons. It's very clear in the documentation that you've outlined today that that is not the case, and that nor was that your intent. So I appreciate that clarification, and I think that it's good to clear that up. The question I have is, in your previous letter, you had asked about interviewing. And so today, subsequent to this, we have the ability to appoint, but also, as we've done for boards like the police board and the hydro board, we have the ability to go and do some thorough interviews with candidates through either this committee or a corporate services committee. I'm wondering if you are encouraging us to interview candidates, in which case we could narrow down a short list of interviews today, or whether you're looking for us to appoint. And I want to know exactly what you're looking for on
that. So thank you, Councillor Morgan. I think you're referring to my letter of the 23rd of March, and that letter is sent on behalf of the board. And in that letter, I state that we endorse the interview process. Of course, you know, ultimately it's your decision about whether you interview or not. I've read out the three names of the recommendations, and then the letter then in juxtaposition, as you say, says, please also know that we would also recommend Roe Mohammed. So we would recommend, but this does potentially represent a conflict of interest in terms of service on the board. And there it's conflict or perceived conflict in terms of some of the decision-making that would be done. We are thin on the ground, so my colleagues have mentioned the idea of adding board members, so we've had conversations around that. We're 9. That's probably actually too small. We've just added now a 4th fully functioning committee, which is Sarah Campbell's Committee on Tenant Services. And that stretches us even more. So we may well be coming back with a question around that. But the last sentence in the letter is, we respectfully suggest SPPC may want to take this into consideration. So ultimately, it was only ever worded as input into your process. So does that answer your question?
Just for clarification, you are saying, yes, you'd still like us to potentially do interviews and dig into the competencies that you've suggested through an interview process. You're not tight on timelines for the leaving member of the board, or you're facing any challenges that will cause us to go into another committee cycle to even make the interviews and the appointments. I just want to be clear that that's not going to create any sort of significant challenges for you, through the chair, of course.
So I don't know exactly how it works inside the City Hall. I think interviews help. I certainly hope they help. You know, we can't direct, so we hope that you would go to that step. For that matter, if you interviewed all the candidates who applied, we're merely highlighting the names that we think seem to fit. Having said that, the competencies don't always map well, partly because we have gaps, but also because the people who depart take expertise with them, and the people who have applied bring certain kinds of expertise, and those may not map onto the competencies that we need at a given time. So there's a lot of moving parts to all of that. But yeah, so if you had an eye on competencies, I think if you looked at this the way we did at our last board meeting, which generated this letter, you'd find that you can't map those competencies that we would really desire in terms of areas of expertise. But the one area that did highlight some questions for us was the lived experience, whether past, present, or in another residence in another provider, for that matter. So that's what I think raised all of this. I think Marcy wants to say something too.
Sure. I just want to add as well. I know as someone who has filled out resumes and applications and et cetera before, I don't always check off the lived experience box. I mean, I don't always recognize that as something that I should do. I will put a lot of things down. So I think the importance of an interview may also bring to light people on the list who do have lived experience that maybe didn't provide an address. So, I mean, whether or not they're a current tenant and you deem that to be okay for someone on our board that's a current tenant, or someone who's lived experience, a past tenant, that may not always stand. So I believe that the interview process will help with that, Av, as well. I know some of the names, and I know there is additional lived experience in the list and of the names we brought forth, and I'm sure an interview process would bring that to light, absolutely. Thank you.
Sorry, and I don't want this to be any longer than it needs to be, as I said already, but so as we're looking at the content of these files during our board meeting on the fly, one thing we're trying to do is map the addresses onto the addresses that we know. So we don't actually have a formal checklist that way. We just happen to sometimes identify an address and other times not. So there's no, as Marcy says, there's no radio button. You know, in that respect, we did actually miss at least one other person who I think is a current tenant, but that we didn't note down, partly because we were trying to identify the women we would recommend for interview, if that, or for appointment ultimately. So.
Just in closing, I don't need any further comment. I appreciate it. I certainly think what you're doing is not abnormal. When I chaired the library board, not only did we come up with a potential job description for library board trustee, we were very active in communicating to municipal council the needs that the board had, given the types of activities that it was proceeding into, and that actually changed over time, whether it was development of a strategic plan or a big capital ask or the hiring of CEO. There are different needs at different times. So I certainly appreciate the communication on what the current needs are of the board, which is why I asked the questions I asked. And certainly I'll be bringing up the concept of an interview later in the agenda when we deal with the appointments, because I've seen value in that process in the past as well.
Councillor Zafman, anyone else?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And through you, I was going to have some things to say, but I'm fairly, I'm sufficient at this point that we have the clarity that we need to move forward, and very much appreciate all the members of the board coming today. Very helpful information. People that clearly doing their homework, and thank you for doing that, and prepared to move ahead at this point.
Councillor Usher.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, I'm certainly disappointed that we're having this conversation. I think that this is taking up, from my perspective, a lot of unnecessary time. I think that in the past, when we had a vacancy, we just did some interviews. But I wasn't going to speak, but the reason I'm going to speak at this point in time is because I heard at the beginning of the conversation that one of the things that they look at is diversity and inclusivity. And one of the problems that we have is that we never look at that. We never look at inclusivity and diversity when we consider board members and when we consider visible minorities being part of these boards. And when we did the Diverse Voices for Change, that is one of the things that we found, that the boards and commissions, they lack visible minorities on their boards. And I think that that should be a priority more than anything else at this point in time. So I'm not going to ask any questions because I'm quite satisfied with the answers that I get. But I'd like to see an interview take place with a certain number so that we could make the selection just as the way we did it in the past. Thank you.
Any other speakers? Now I have Councillor Hopkins who's going to wrap up. Councillor Hopkins?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I just want to thank my colleagues for the conversation. I am a bit dismayed, though, because of I guess the emphasis here on some boards and not others. And I really think we should be very careful when we start looking at should we accept certain recommendations or not, depending on what board it is, that we have a clear understanding what we're doing here and that we have a fair playing field with all boards. And I do think it's important that certain boards somehow get signaled out. That's how I feel. I'm just being fair and open and honest here with you. I do want to take this time, though, to thank the board members who are volunteers and who spend an awful lot of work on this board. They really care about what they're doing. They're just not putting in time. And I think it's really important that we, when we look at our boards and our commissions, that we do look at the volunteers and the work that they do. I can say that because I work with these people on the board. I know what I'm talking about, and I very often don't say too much. I just assume we all know the great work that this board is doing. So it's just my opportunity to speak on behalf of London Middlesex Housing Board and to thank them for their work.
Did you want to address that?
Sure, just a word of appreciation for Councillor Hopkins' work on our board. We know her as Anna. I know that Anna called me the day after your last meeting and just wondered how, what the impact of the conversation was going to be. And as I said, we've reviewed the tape, I don't think actually there was anything particularly problematic. There was some questioning about some items. I think most of it was technical. But in the end, there was a fair bit of public discourse that was quite noisy, and it does have an impact, and it's important for me to tell you that. So it had an impact on your colleague who had to spend some time with me on the phone, and that's not the best thing for her to be doing, but it also had an impact on our CEO, who's had to pour significant, we're only volunteers, he's a paid employee, and Josh Brown had to return to the office and write a memo to all staff at LMHC, reassuring them that yes, we do care about diversity and inclusion, which of course is about the most ridiculous waste of time that I could imagine. So I think, Councillor Usher, you said the words waste of time. Your words, not mine, but I guess I owe you a drink of water for saying it, because we have spent so much time on this in the last 2 weeks, and it really is all for naught as far as I'm concerned. You know, the conflict of interest is an important piece. It's important for us to advise you on that, recognizing though ultimately that it's your choice to do what you like with the appointment process, including whether you interview or not. And as I say, I'm not pinning this necessarily on this forum because I watched the tape, and but your words had an influence out there, and it seemed to be misconstrued as our commitments to the kinds of things that we're all trying to espouse in our community. And so this is a word of gratitude for Councillor Hopkins and wearing the many hats that she does on our board, and particularly also to our CEO for the amount of time it's taken for him to just address something that was fundamentally really nothing at all. But you know, perception is reality, they say. So anyway, we appreciate the time, and if there's nothing else, then I think we'll be seeing you at the annual general meeting in June.
Thank you for your delegation. I don't believe I have any additional speakers. Councillor Salih?
Sorry, I was going to leave it, but I'm just confused because there was quite a few mentions, because I know I missed that part of the meeting. But there was mentions about I guess, confusions with the media or discourse that was having. I'm not following, I guess. So I'm not sure what happened at that point. So I'm just trying to better educate. I don't know if you're able to fill me in or what, but it was mentioned like 4 or 5 times.
Sorry, Councillor, I was not in attendance at the meeting, yeah. All set? Okay. So just as we're wrapping up this delegation, thank you for being here. We have a couple additional areas that will be focused on your board, so please stay as long as you'd like. And I'll say quickly from the chair, on my 7.5 years on council, the quality of debate and dedication to your board from your board members, I've never seen anything like it. And the level of sophistication related to the work that I see, specifically looking ahead at that maintenance deficit and the kind of challenges that we're going to face around that. And finally, and most importantly, how much care your board brings forward. It's right in your language, and that this is all about people, and that there is room for love and there is room to care, and I certainly personally see that every single day. And so thank you for volunteering your time, and stay tuned. We're going to deal with a couple of other items, and thanks for coming back to this horseshoe to further the discussion. Okay, colleagues, so a couple of things that came up in that line of questioning. Should we identify an interview process and introduce that stage as we're making this final decision? And also, we have added, I'll draw to your attention, we have a request for delegation status from John Perry. I think I'm saying that name correctly. I'm going to suggest a couple of things. Number one, if it was the committee's intent to grant that delegation status, it would make much more sense for us to make that decision now than as we move into B. If it's the committee's intent to look to nominate some of the names here and move to an interview option in the weeks to come, then maybe less so. But I would require a mover and a seconder if we were to grant delegation status. And I'd also look for some debate on that before we make the decision. And perhaps also some advice from the city clerk. So I see it's been moved by Councillor Armstrong. Is there a seconder? Okay. There's no seconder, so. Moved by Councillor Armstrong to grant delegation status to John Perry. Okay, and seconded by? To debate? Okay, seconded by Councillor Morgan. So we can enter into debate. I think the first thing I'd like to do is look to the city clerk and see if she has any comments about granting delegation status to one applicant and not providing the opportunity to all others.
Through Mr. Chair, generally under the council procedure bylaw, when we receive requests for delegation status, the committee has a number of choices, one of which is to A, not grant the delegation, B, refer it to a future meeting, or grant the delegation. I do note that the request for delegation did come from an individual who is also listed as one of the applicants.
Okay, any speakers? Councillor Ridley, Councillor Usher.
Thank you. I'll speak to delegation status. I would be prepared to support a delegation status at a future meeting. I think when we have a list of candidates, it's a can of worms that we may not want to open by having some appear and speak to us prior to that vote. But if the delegate would like to return to another meeting, if there's another issue that's not specific to the nomination, that's not a process that I think is great for council to get into, because then we would have, you know, the applications, delegations, interviews, and before selection, which just really creates an onerous process that I don't think is necessary. So if the delegate, I've always supported delegation requests. If delegate would like to speak to us about our process or about something in the future, I'd be happy to refer the delegation to a future meeting. But I don't think it's a fair practice to the other candidates to have one delegate speak ahead of the nominations today.
Thank you, Councillor. And we'll get some clarity on this motion on whether it's to receive today or at a later date. We'll make sure that that wording is carefully understood before I call the question. I have Councillor Usher and Turner. Anyone else?
Well, I'll make mine brief, Mr. Chair, because Councillor Ridley has says lots of what I would have liked to say. I would much prefer to go to an interview process. I think that I have enough information from each applicant here, and I don't want to give any other applicant the advantage of standing up here to reinforce their application. That's where I stand with this. So I'm not in favor of a delegation status at all at this point in time. Thank you.
Councillor Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to re-articulate the points of my colleagues, unfortunately. Sorry, guys. But thank you for saying it. I think the question is, where does it land? It's a question of governance and in terms of reference associated with our boards and commissions that may be most appropriate at the governance working group rather than at SPPC. I just throw that out as a recommendation, but I think the points that the member wanted to articulate are well laid out in his letter and are considered for by the committee. So I think to reiterate the points of my colleagues, it would be inappropriate at this time for one candidate on the list to have that opportunity to speak.
Other speakers? Okay, just to get a sense of that motion, I'm going to look to the mover and the seconder. Was it your intention to make a motion to allow delegation status to occur today, or are you both comfortable with language that would grant delegation status at a future meeting and specifically at the governance working group, as Councillor Turner suggested? Councillor Morgan?
Seems to me the individual is here today, so perhaps today would be the best, I think. But I don't believe they elaborated as to when they wanted delegate, whether it was today or in the future.
Okay, I'll look to the seconder to see if that's a motion.
They're here
he's
today, so maybe that's a question that could be asked in them, because they may be happy with the future, and then that'll save us even discussing it further.
Yeah, well, what might also save us discussing it further is to see if there's convergence between the mover's motion and the seconder of that motion.
Okay, we'll see if boys can come.
Councillor Morgan wants to have that delegation today or at another time.
Yes, so I seconded it because I wanted to hear what the clerk had to say, because the way it was being presented was, we'll see if there's a second, then we'll hear what the clerk has to say about the appropriateness of the delegation. Sounds like my colleagues want to do it at a future time. I would side with them since that's the vote that sounds like it's going to pass. There's no point in voting on something that's not going to pass, so I'll only support it if it's in the future.
Your worship, I can go along with that.
Okay, great. So let's have that motion read at a future meeting of the governance working group or appropriate committee. It being noted that. Okay, colleagues, the motion is up on screen. We're dealing with Part C now.
The second one on your screen.
And so if you look at the second window, that the request for delegation status for John Perry be approved at a future meeting of the appropriate committee with respect to the matter of the membership of the London Middlesex Housing Corporation. Any additional speakers? Okay, let's call the question.
Mayor, I vote manually yea. Mayor Brown? I'll vote
You
manually,
vote
yea.
yea? Okay, we're voting on that specific request for delegation status.
Councillor Cassidy? Closing the vote, and the motion carries 13-2.
Great. Okay, let us circle back. Let's deal with B now. We'll need a motion to receive the delegation, but we'll deal with that at the end. So I know there was some discussion previously about an interview process, and I'm wondering if that's the direction the committee wants to go, and if so, if we could have a mover and a seconder for specific names on this list that we would invite for an interview. Councillor Van Holst, Councillor Helmer, Councillor Park.
Thank you. I'd be happy to move that we interview at least the 4 individuals recommended by the LMHC. So that's Elizabeth Palooza, Deborah J. Peckham, Roa Mohammed, and Anna Marie Evans.
Okay, look for a seconder for those names. Seconded by Councillor Salee. Sorry, I was looking to my right. And so we'll have those people on the list. And now we'll look for other names. I have Councillor Helmer, Park, Usher, Ridley.
I remember in the olden times when we used to take nominations like this, and we stopped, and I'd like to continue to not do that, and instead take nominations for a ranked ballot and narrow it down to who we want to interview through a ranked ballot process. I don't know why every once in a while we just forget about that whole process. So I'm fine with those people being nominated for the ranked ballot. I think because we have so many candidates, it makes sense to just nominate a subset and then have a ranked ballot to figure out. I think we should interview 3 candidates. So I think we should try and narrow it down to 3 and then interview 3 people, and we'll pick from there who is the best person to go onto the board. So that's how I'd like to proceed. I definitely do not want to just nominate people for interview.
We can certainly do that. Let's work our way through the speakers list. Councillor Park?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The folks that I was going to suggest have already been nominated.
Councillor Asher?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to pretty much say the same thing, but I would like only 3 names. I don't want 4.
Certainly the ranked ballot process would allow us to get there, just based on the rankings. Councillor Ridley?
I think this may be unpopular, but I was going to ask if the committee wished to interview all of the candidates. I was thinking about the Corporate Services Committee, where I recognize that there are recommendations. I think that through the process of interviewing, the committee would best be able to find the strengths of the candidates and make a good recommendation back to this committee. So just going to throw that out there, and then I might exit quietly.
We're so glad that you did. Before we move forward, in thinking too much about that, is there a seconder for something like that? This is to interview all candidates.
All 10?
Yes. I don't believe I see a seconder for that. So let's just carry on with our discussion. Thank you, Councillor Ridley. Deputy Mayor Hubert, did you want to speak? And Councillor Hopkins?
No, I don't need to speak. I was just going to refer it if there was a seconder to the governance working group to do all the interviews.
Okay. Councillor Hopkins.
Yes, can you refresh my memory? Where are we in this discussion here, and what is being said prior to the discussion we just had?
So I had a speakers list that we've worked our way through. There's been a suggestion that we move and have a mover and a seconder of the 4 names brought forward by London Middlesex Housing. And there's been another suggestion that we do a ranked ballot vote, which would get us potentially to a similar position, but it would allow us to, each member to have the ability to vote for and rank every applicant. So we're kind of at a decision point here. Yeah. Go ahead.
So what I would like to suggest, and I don't know where this is in this conversation, there were three female names that were submitted by London Middlesex Housing for interviews. I would like to bring those three names forward, and if you want to add some extra names so we can go through the ranked ballot process, I would be okay with that. But I would like to just start with putting those three names forward. That was in the March letter. I think there were three names at that time.
So we'll make a decision right now, but in summary, right now, we have a mover and a seconder for four names all identified by the London Middlesex Housing Corporation Board. And there's been a suggestion from another councillor that we should go to the ranked ballot process. And so what I'd like to do is let's break this down into two steps. Let's determine if the majority of this committee wants to go in the ranked ballot process direction. If they are, then we'll move in that direction. If not, then we'll continue with these nominations. So I'm going to suggest that Councillor Helmer moved that we use the ranked ballot system. And is there a seconder for that? Okay, seconded by Councillor Ridley. And so what I'm going to ask then is for the clerk to please distribute the ranked ballots. Sorry, you're right. That's right, we do. We vote around here. So that'll come up on screen in a minute. And are there any speakers? Okay, I have Councillor Helmer and then Armstrong.
Okay, so I did not suggest that we have a ranked ballot for all the candidates. I explicitly said we should have a ranked ballot and nominate people. So we could nominate, say, 5 people, and then we could just vote on it. We'd figure out who the 3 people are. We've done it so many times at committee. I hesitate to even keep talking about it. I don't even understand why we're talking about different options. We literally have not done what has been suggested by Councillor Van Holst in years. So I get that this is coming at the tail end of a fairly long discussion about board appointments, and perhaps people are a little frustrated or want to get it over with or something, but let's follow the process we've used for all appointments for years, which is to nominate people for a ranked ballot, do the ranked ballot, interview them. We've done it for Hydro. We've done it for a variety of organizations in the past. I'm not sure what the problem is. I hope people will support doing what we've done for years and years and not nominate the people they'd like to be considered. I think those 4 people, as I said, are good candidates to be nominated for the ranked ballot. I also think Roger Moran would be good. And if no one else is nominating him, I would nominate him as well.
Okay, so we will look for other speakers. I have Councillor Armstrong. This is on whether or not we move towards ranked ballot. Councillor Van Holst, you may be able to be helpful here.
Thank you, Your Worship.
Councillor Van Holst, are you rising on point of personal privilege, or do you have some additional information about the motion you brought forward?
May I can? I'm happy to accept this as a friendly amendment. So I was certainly open to that. I was just hoping to put forward the 4 names that they had into our process. And if it's a ranked ballot process that we've done.
Councillor Salee was the seconder. He's nodding his head as well. So right now, what we're deciding on is whether we have a ranked ballot process. Well, we're not anymore because Councillor Van Holst, it's his motion and we're moving in that direction. We have 4 names that have been nominated for this ranked ballot process. Anna Maria Evans, Roa Mohammed, Deborah Peckham, and Elizabeth Pelosa. So are there any other names that you want to bring forward for this? Councillor Usher?
I don't really want to bring, I have another name that I want to bring, but I would not like to bring it because I don't want to complicate this. I think the 4 that we have is better because once you get one person adding another name, then there'll be another, and before you know it, we'll do all of them. So.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? Councillor Armstrong, I've got in the speakers list. Did you want to speak? You're good? You're on the speakers list.
No, I am, and you can take me off.
Any other names? Councillor Cassidy.
Sorry, Your Worship, just to add some hopefully clarification, I believe Councillor Helmer added a 5th name, Mr. Roger Moran.
Councillor Helmer, did you want to bring that name forward?
Yes, that is what I said.
Okay, a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Cassidy. So we've got 5 names. Any other names? Councillor Usher.
Sorry, if we're going to add names, then I'm going to add Steve Hiller.
Seconded by Councillor Van Holst. Any other names? Okay, so the ballots will be prepared and distributed. Councillor Turner.
Thank you. While that's going on, just to get clarification, I think the Councillor Helmer had stated that we rank to 3 names. And is that the agreement or the motion, the consensus there?
That's my understanding, that Councillor Van Holst indicated he saw those as friendly amendments, and so we'll be looking at 3 names. The top 3 names would then be interviewed. Councillor Morgan and Hopkins.
Okay, so for clarity, there are 5 names on the list. You need to rank all 5 of them. They're going to narrow it down to 3, and those are the 3 we're going to interview, right? That is the process we're following? 6. Sorry, 6, yes.
Councillor Hopkins.
I couldn't have said it any better than Councillor Morgan. Thank you for clarifying that.
Okay, those ballots will be distributed in just a minute. Councillor Ridley.
Thank you. I'm reluctant to complicate this further, but I wonder why we don't just have all the names on and rank them and take the top 3.
I think it's the will of the committee to move in this direction and not that direction. Councillor Park.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Recognizing that this may take a few moments, I wonder if we could have a 5 or 10-minute recess, whatever.
I think that's a great idea.
Work.
We'll look to the clerk. How much time do you think you'll need to work through this? About 10 minutes? Okay. So a motion for a 10-minute recess? Yeah, and so just before we do that, let's do a motion to receive Part A, the delegation. Moved by Councillor Park, seconded by Deputy Mayor Hubert. Any discussion? We'll wait for that to come up on screen.
Yay. My screen's not working right now. It's a second.
Closing the vote, and that motion carries 15-0.
Okay, colleagues, there's been a suggestion to also deal with 4.1. This is London Hydro's request for a shareholder meeting, so I'll look for a motion on that. Councillor Van Holst, seconded by Councillor Usher. Any discussion? Okay, that'll come up in a moment. Councillor Salee votes manually, yay. Councillor Salee?
Michael has the mic on. Yay. Whoa. Yay.
Closing the vote, and that motion carries 14-0.
And a motion to take a recess, I think about 5 minutes. We'll be back here at 20 after. Moved by Councillor Park, seconded by Councillor Usher. All those in favor? Thanks, everybody. See you in 5. Okay, we've got quorum. We're just past that target time of 5:20. Thank you very much to our city clerk for working through that spreadsheet so quickly. Over to you, Kathy.
Mr. Chair, based on the ranked ballot process, the three remaining candidates for interviews are Roa Mohammed, Deborah Peckham, and Elizabeth Pelosa.
Excellent. Okay, we'll just have a motion come up on screen. Need a mover for that? Moved by Councillor Slee, seconded by Councillor Armstrong. Any discussion? Just to confirm, we'll send a letter of thanks to all applicants for putting their name forward. And we'll work to have some interviews scheduled as well. So it's been moved, it's been seconded. Any other discussion? We'll wait for that vote to come up on screen. Okay, let's call the question. We're voting.
Mayor Brown, I'm still having problems with mine, so yay.
Councillor Slee is a yay.
Closing the vote, and that motion carries 15-0.
And looking for then a motion to go into confidential session for the reasons outlined under 6.1. Moved by Councillor Van Holst, seconded by Councillor Usher. Any discussion? Come up on screen in a moment. Okay, let's call the question. We are voting. And colleagues, we'll go to committee room 3 for the closed session. We'll adjourn from committee room 3. So anyone watching from home, it's very unlikely that we'll be back in council chambers this evening, but you can tune in tomorrow night for council, 4 o'clock.
And I'll vote yay.
Councillor Slee votes yay.
Closing the vote, and that motion carries 15-0.
Colleagues, see you in committee room 3.